All right, so we'll finish up with chapter 2 here today, turning to global foundations of law. There's basically four different types of foundations of law that I want you guys to know. That's Islamic or Sharia law, socialist law, common law, or civil slash code slash Napoleonic law. All right, so Islamic law is the first foundational law that we need to talk about. And basically, what really separates Islamic law from the other four is that Islamic law is a welding of religious and secular law into one, whereas many laws have a separation between religion and state or religion and nation. That's exactly the opposite of Islamic law. Islamic law is directly derived from the Quran, which are the teachings and writings of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, one of the things that I want you to know is that even though there's many countries that follow Islamic law, or Sharia law as it's also called, the way that it's followed varies greatly from one country to the next. So, for instance, in a country like Lebanon, it's very, very mildly uh, influenced by Sharia law, versus another country like Saudi Arabia, one that's really closed off and only until recently women couldn't be educated, women couldn't drive. Sharia law was followed very, very strictly. So just because you hear that a country is following Sharia law doesn't mean that it's really strict. It could mean that it's really open as well. So you want to know exactly about how that country tends to follow, whether it's very conservative or very liberal in the way it views laws. Second foundation of law is socialist law. Socialist law is basically follows the ideas of Marx, and it says that you can't have private property, everything's owned by the state, and everything is regulated by the government. So this is what we tend to see in the old Soviet Union. We tend to see it still really strongly in North Korea and Cuba, somewhat so in China and Vietnam. But socialist law is essentially pulls from that Marxist view. Now, common law is what we have here in the United States. Its origins are in England, and judges tend to be very important in this legal system. They tend to draw from previous decisions by judges to establish law. And so it's very common in the United States for when a judge is making a decision to pull from a time before the United States even existed, from the 1600s, to pull from English law. So it really pulls back far, and we see it in places that England colonized, like the United States, Canada, Austria, and New Zealand, along with, of course, the United Kingdom. Now, one area where we don't have common law in the United States is Louisiana in the United States. So Louisiana is the only state that doesn't have common law. We have civil or code or Roman or Napoleonic law. And this is derived from Roman law in the sense that everything is written down. This is how Napoleon did it. This is how the French did it. A lot of Latin countries do this. Judges are less important in these types of countries because everything's written down and you know exactly what the penalties are when laws are broken and how to interpret whether the laws are broken. So that's the main difference between civil and common is the importance of the judge. Now let's turn to international law. International law is really interesting here because it's very theoretical. There's no international court per se. There's no international law like we have laws of the Constitution or laws in the United States. So what I really want you to think about is that the international laws are kind of just agreements. What we might call them gentlemen's agreements, but they're agreements that don't really exist on paper. So even though we're using the word law here, it's not really like that. And we're going to talk about some of the main principles of international law here and what they mean. So the very first and most important international law is the law of sovereignty or sovereign immunity. And basically, what sovereign immunity says is that a country has the right to govern themselves any way they see fit. So if you want to be a communist government or if you want to be a totalitarian government, then you have the right as a country to govern yourself the way that you want to. It means that just because we like democracy here in the United States and we like capitalism, it means that we respect any other country the way that they want to govern themselves. And that's sovereignty. They have their own right to be a sovereign and free country. And that's basically the very first principle of international law. Now, how about jurisdiction? What happens to citizens and to when countries interact? Well, that's when we get into international jurisdiction, and I want to talk about three principles of international jurisdiction that you should know. The first is the nationality principle, and it's basically a principle that says countries have jurisdiction over their citizens no matter where they are located. Okay, now what we recognize right from the start is that that's not always the case. If an American breaks a law in another country, or they run to another country after they've broken an American law, most of the time countries will ship them back. But if they're in a country that's not friendly with the United States, so let's say Russia, there was a person who worked for intelligence agencies in the United States. His name was Edward Snowden, and he went to Russia to kind of run from the United States. And Russia has not returned him. He's been hanging out there, kind of in diplomatic limbo, so to speak. But most other countries that we're on friendly terms with would return someone to us, even if they were in another country. And we have those agreements with other countries as well. If a Mexican criminal commits a crime and he's wanted by a Mexican state, then we'll return him. So that's the nationality principle. The territoriality principle is that basically, even if you're an American citizen and you're in another country, if you break a law in another country's territory, you're responsible. So just because you didn't know that it was illegal to chew gum in Singapore, or just because you didn't know that it was illegal to drive in the left lane in Germany, when there's no other cars on the road, it doesn't mean you can get away with it. You have to honor and respect their laws, even if you don't know about them. So that's a territorial principle. And then the protective principle is basically kind of a self-defense principle. It suggests that if there's a clear and present danger that another country has over you, that you have the right as a country to protect yourself. So if a country is attacking you, or if a country sends people over or launches a web attack, that you have the right to protect yourself, even though they might not be in your country or might not be citizens in the country. You have the right to protect yourself, your jurisdiction. Now, the doctrine of comity is basically how other countries treat their citizens and how a secondary country has to respect how other countries treat their own citizens. So even though we don't have corporal punishment in the United States, physical abuse, we don't whip people with chains or whip people with sticks. There are countries out there that do, and particularly Singapore, they have canings for people that break laws, and our courts have to respect the decisions in Singapore of those countries to physically punish their citizens. So doctrine of comity is all about jurisdiction over countries' own citizens when they're in their own country. Now, an act of state doctrine has more to do about how courts must respect the decisions of other courts in other countries. So when U.S. courts make decisions in international cases, they have to respect the decisions that courts have made in those other countries in which they might make their decisions. So, for instance, there's certain countries that make big corporations pay huge penalties for profit limits. Once a company reached a certain amount of profit, then basically 90% of everything that they make has to go towards paying taxes, and this is in some countries. So the United States has to respect United States laws, and courts have to respect profit limits. That's something that doesn't exist in the United States. You can make as much money as you want. You still get taxed at a kind of constant rate. So that's an example of what the active state doctrine is. The treatment and rights of aliens. This is an interesting one, something that we've had a big issue with in this country, and other countries have the same issue, is that since you're a sovereign state, you have the right to refuse admission of any foreign citizens to your country. So you have the right to stop anybody who wants to come in from coming into your country. Now, you also have the right to be able to restrict where they travel in a country. So, for instance, in the United States, sometimes we'll let doctors or lawyers that are very important in other countries come into the country, but we'll say you can only stay at this hotel, or you can only go to this conference, because we might consider them some sort of danger as far as terrorist threats or being sympathizing with our enemies. So it's not just that you can reject people. You can also limit where they go and say that they can only stay for a few days. And all nations also have the right to deport aliens, people that are here illegally, and no matter where they're at. Now, how do we think about settling disputes that are kind of international? Well, U.S. courts do have some jurisdiction. This is kind of interesting here because we have such firm laws, and we're not necessarily a nation that follows laws. We do have a lot of people incarcerated, and we have a lot of criminals. We are a nation that is built on laws and that respects laws, and other countries enjoy that from a business perspective. They like that if you build a corporation here or start a company here, that it has rights that tend to have held up over hundreds of years, over time. So this is a big advantage for the U.S. Court system, is to be able to kind of be a business's judge and jury. And so a lot of people want to do business here because of that. And so what U.S. courts have said is they will hear a case brought before them if one of the following three things is true: that the plaintiffs are located here in the United States, so where the act occurred was in the United States, or where the foul or harm occurred was in the United States. Or, number two, where the evidence was gathered. So maybe they weren't located in the United States, but the crime itself occurred in the United States, or the evidence is in the United States. Or, number three, that maybe they're not located in the United States and the crime didn't occur in the United States, but the company that is being charged or accused has property in the United States where all their value is and where all their capital is. So if one of those three things is true, then U.S. courts will tend to hear cases. It doesn't mean that they'll go forward with the case. It just means they'll read about it and consider it. Now, as far as we talked about this earlier, about regulation, basically policies are instituted by different governments, and what these policies are aimed at in the international context is to either increase trade or protect national businesses. So that's essentially what a tariff is. Tariffs that we saw on steel and aluminum, America put a tariff on Chinese steel and aluminum. That makes the price of steel and aluminum go up because Chinese have to charge more to pay for that tariff. It also protects American steel and aluminum companies because they don't have the same tariff, so they can charge a little bit less comparatively than Chinese. But what tariffs do is, and they make the other country then kind of fight back with a tariff. And what we talked about in class was that instead of the Chinese putting a tariff on our steel and aluminum, which they don't use very much of, they put it on milk or some of the heartland kind of goods that tend to be perishable. So it was a little tricky there what they did, and that's one reason why milk is very cheap right now, because there's a big supply of it, and milk farmers have to get rid of it. And I'm going to talk about technology and how technology is shifting in class. But I do want you to know that a few of the things that I wanted you to know about, I want you guys to make sure you know what biotechnology is and supercomputers are. Biotechnology and nanotechnology and supercomputers, probably talk about that in class. And then how these technological shifts are going to affect kind of the work that you guys are going to be doing.